And what I'm going to share with you is some work that we did with industry that perhaps is going to provide a different way. And I'd actually argue perhaps Jackie presented the 3 ways in which the construction industry thinks we can attack this challenge. I perhaps would focus on, I think it was the bottom right-hand corner or left-hand corner of Stan Stacey's model, where he mentioned long-term planning and balancing demand and supply, because I fundamentally think that maybe that's a 4th stream, that if you really want to change and think about things differently, that's a capability that you need to start focusing on. And the other thing to bear in mind, and this is where our worlds do come together, when you are undergraduates, maybe in a master's degree, you may have come across a very simple model which was first developed back in the late 1970s by Hayes and Wheelwright, but was brought to life by an ops management academic, Nigel Slack. And he talks about a trade-off between product and process. And in a way he talks about that really when you look at products, there's a degree of complexity, high complexity, low complexity, high variety, low variety. And then there's volume, low volume or high volume. And you get a diagonal, and what they essentially say is, you've got to get the right process, manufacturing process for the type of product. And if you've got a product that's very high variety, really it's likely to be relatively low volume, and you'll be making it in a sort of job shop, one-off sort of way. And that's where projects used to sit. And at the opposite extreme, you've got very, very high volume, very low variety, which is where fast-moving consumer goods sit. And if you guys really want to learn about supply chain, if you really want to learn about manufacturing, it's not the automotive industry, it's not the aerospace industry, they sort of sit badly in the middle and don't necessarily always do things well. Really, the people that are best at manufacturing and supply chain are the people in fast-moving consumer goods. And so what we did through actually an Innovate UK grant, we worked with Costain and with a very small SME that was developing some supply chain analytics software. What we decided is we wanted to take some of our best practice that we trialled out with a global FTSE top 10 company in fast-moving consumer goods around demand profiling, and try it and see how it could apply to construction. So I'm going to share with you some of the stuff that you could learn from fast-moving consumer goods. That's not something I think you would normally be looking at. I'm going to share with you some of the lessons we learned when we took that knowledge and actually applied it to the water sector, and how we made sense of it, because they're pretty different worlds. Toothpaste in the case of the water, I suppose they do come together, but they're not naturally together. And then how I think personally, you'll learn I have opinions. This could help to transform not just construction in terms of housing, but actually I would also make a plea that this is infrastructure more generally. So what did we borrow? Now, one of the things that absolutely drives me crazy is that lean is actually a philosophy. Now, if I was to say lean to you, but just shout out now what you think of as the first word that comes to your mind when I say lean. What do you think it's all about in one word?
Waste.
Waste. Who said that? In that nice, strong voice. That is what we've come to associate lean with, waste reduction. And this is a bit of a misnomer. I had the opportunity back in the early 1990s, showing my age now, to actually study in Japan for a year. And part of the reason I wanted to study in Japan, I studied Japanese language there, was because I was slightly obsessed about Japanese manufacturing strategy. Now, fundamentally, at the highest level, lean is a philosophy. When we start to talk about waste, that really came about because consultants needed to find a way to be able to sell lean as a product, and they tended not to get in at the top level of an organisation but the bottom, and so they sort of productised it into, let me into your department so I can help you reduce, take waste out and save money. Lean is a philosophy. It is about the way that you choose to run your business, and it's based on 5 principles. The first of those is that you need to understand customer value. Whether you're selling toothpaste, cigarettes, pharmaceuticals, building a hospital or a school or a house, you need to know what people want. And then, if you look at that second principle, it's about developing value streams. And note, there is an S on the end of value streams. Can you think why? Why doesn't it just say value stream in the singular? Pardon?
There's more than one.
There's more than one, and that's because not all customers value the same things. Then you need to make it flow, and that's because a good supply chain, a good end-to-end supply chain, a good manufacturing process is set up to run at the beat of customer demands. And then you can make it, and therefore it flows at the pull of the customer, and we never stand still. We should always be trying to pursue continuous improvement, and that's where a lot of the lean performance improvement tools and techniques have come in, and that's sort of where we picked up the waste bit. We've only really focused on that last bit. And lean, for me, actually exists at 3 levels. It exists at a philosophy, and you find me an organisation to which those principles do not stand true, but equally find me an organisation where people in that organisation can cite you the 5 lean principles, and they're probably both equally as rare. Secondly, it exists as a supply chain strategy, which I'll come on to explain, and that's the difference between lean as a strategy for dealing with stable demand and agility as a strategy to deal with more variable demand, and it exists as a third level, as a set of performance improvement tools and techniques that we should always pursue wherever we are to make things more efficient. So what did we learn? We actually found, when we tried to take these principles, and what we were looking at Costain, and Costain were operating a water contract for one of the major water companies. And this major water company, for those of you who are not familiar with water, they essentially give people a 5-year planning horizon. And the idea was, if we give you a 5-year planning horizon, you should be able to plan better and therefore be more effective and more efficient. That's the thinking behind it. Are any of you involved with the Ministry of Defence, warships and submarines? No. So previously I'd done some work with the MOD looking at warships and submarines. They've now given the contractors for warships and subs 20 years because they recognise that if you give people a longer planning horizon, coming back to Sam's box, they should be able to plan better and you should be able to be more efficient and effective, hence more productive. But when we started to look at Costain and their supply chain in water, two principles began to emerge. One is this idea of an end-to-end value chain orientation, and the second is an idea of innovation through repeatability. Because one of the other things that struck me about working in construction, every contractor you seem to come across wants to be innovative. So if everyone's being innovative, who's doing the work that needs to be done today? Because actually we don't necessarily need innovation for everything, or if we do, it's not necessarily always product innovation, it might be innovation in the process. So just to expand on these 2 points, but not with this glittery thing. Have any of you heard of something called the Supply Chain Operations Reference Model? Put your hands up if you've heard of the Supply Chain Operations Reference Model. One person. Shame on you, construction industry. 2 people. Okay, we're going to put your hands up now. Do you want to explain what it is? It's virtually that. It's an industry standard. As with many of these things, it was developed in America by something called the Supply Chain Council. And essentially it says that a supply chain is made up of 5 core processes: planning, procurement, manufacturing and logistics, and that good organisations, when they study their supply chain, they look at it across at least 5 echelons, because they start with their customer's customer, then their firm, and then they look at their supplier, and then their supplier's supplier. So when I talk about supply chain, I'm talking about something from a customer's customer to a supplier's supplier with a focal firm in the middle. And I haven't always been in academia, but for all of the time that I've been in academia, my research is looking at least 5 organisations and trying to create flow across those 5 organisations. And that's because since a very famous professor, probably one of the founding fathers of supply chain in the UK, Martin Christopher, he actually did his PhD just down the road at Bradford. He said since in 1992, so not even recently, it's supply chains that compete, not individual firms. So if you want to transform construction, you need to have construction supply chains competing, not the individual players within them. And the score model, that sort of way of looking at things, will help you do that. Now, one of the things we wanted to see was, did this model actually apply to a water supply chain? And what we actually found, it did, but we had to look at things a little bit differently. This particular water company was involved in quite a complex alliance. So we had alliance strategy, then we had a joint venture strategy, and then we get into the territory where you guys will be more familiar, that sort of territory around programme management and project management. But fundamentally, they then didn't talk about long-term planning. They had this very narrow view of supply chain planning in terms of material and resource planning. And fundamentally, what they thought a supply chain was procurement. So one of the things that really frustrates me with your industry, it's not just you, the British government needs a lot of education too, and believe me, I am trying to do it. We work a lot with BAEs. And our battle is to get them to call supplier management procurement, because that's what it is. And supply chain management is about managing this end-to-end piece. Because there's a huge difference. Procurement or supplier management is just about managing your suppliers. And if we pass that off as supply chain management, we're missing that huge opportunity of making our supply chains compete and not individual firms. And when we looked at it, so procurement or supplier management exists. In the water space, Costain, like many of the large organisations, don't actually make anything, they manage other people to do things. So in a way though, the make function you could consider as the sort of design and build element. And then what we see as deliver, or in a traditional supply chain as the logistics part, you could think more about as the commissioning and handover phase. But the huge gap that we saw was this, essentially they just set up the contracts with their suppliers and then they called off the materials against it. There was no, what we would call, strategic supply chain planning capability in that supply chain whatsoever, which actually meant it was pretty useless, anyone giving them a 5-year planning horizon, because they never got to see the benefit of it. The water company just released the projects every 3 months. So what's the point of having a 5-year contract if your demand is given to you every 3 months? You're not going to be effective nor efficient. And part of that comes about because the industry, your industry, doesn't recognise the importance of planning. And the second thing, we only should be innovative where we really have to be. We should only be collaborative in the sort of person-to-person sense when we really have to be, because it takes a lot of effort. Let me be honest, how many of you are married to more than one person? Maybe you don't want to admit to it. Because actually, a marriage takes a lot of effort. Maybe it's different up here in Leeds, I don't know. And fundamentally, if you start to think about it, most of the work that you're doing, if you're dealing with a water company and the upgrade of water assets, is actually repeatable. It's the same stuff. But actually, they don't view it as repeatable stuff because the water company was just giving them a project every 3 months. And so, borrowing from fast-moving consumer goods, a lot of my work's been around this principle called demand profiling, which is every company I go to says my demand's variable. Every company I've ever looked at, we can find 70 to 80% stable demand. Right the way from warships and submarines through to toothpaste, and I will come to show you even the water industry. And essentially what we're saying, if you've got stable demand, essentially what you want is to then have that 5-year period to identify those repeatable projects so you can actually manage them as a series of repeatable projects. That then gives you long-term planning. It also means if the water company is going to say not all our budget's fixed, you can say that's fine, at least 70% of your budget's fixed, you've got 30% for flex. You can use your framework agreements properly because you can give all your suppliers 5 5 years vision too. But actually, this isn't collaborative in a personal sense. Your computers do the collaboration, because this is all standard stuff, it's repeatable, and so everything can be executed through your collaborative ERP systems. And really, in manufacturing, we call this a call-off order. This is how manufacturing runs all the time. However, there may be some projects where you do require some innovation, or equally, the water company can't assign all of their budget 5 years in advance, so that's where we get this more emergent work. And here we'd suggest, because one of the other big issues we saw is contractors get really fed up when the people that contracted for the design are not the people that do the make, because you don't necessarily make the money on the design phase, you might make the money on the make phase. And so what they're saying is, go out to competition to see who's best to do the package, but then allow someone to do the design and make, and it would be a different type of contract. And actually, when we looked at this, so we essentially took a planning horizon for Costain dealing with their water company, and unsurprisingly, we found that 84% of the projects that we analysed were potentially predictable, and 56% were repeatable. So we actually proved this concept from fast-moving consumer goods could work in construction, if only, actually it's the water company needs to learn to plan properly, and that water company needs to put that into practice and give people a 5-year planning horizon for those repeatable projects. So that's all very nice, and I'm not going to be able to publish my boring academic paper just being able to say that. Costain would be happy, other industrialists could be happy. So how do we make sense of this from a more academic perspective? So in order to do that, Jennifer's always my best critic when she says, sometimes we think things haven't been done in construction before, and she'll say that they have, and we can be more innovative than we have been. But actually in this case, what we did, we went back to a guy called Tim Brady, who had known us at Cranfield, and I knew that he'd done a lot of work looking at Terminal 5, and when we were doing this work at Costain, people kept saying, Terminal 5, they wanted to be more like Terminal 5, and they didn't know how to be, so I thought, you know what, why don't we try to reflect on our results and find out if they want to be like Terminal 5, what's stopping them getting there. And so we used a research approach, which is called an abductive research approach. So we took our prior theoretical knowledge around supply chain segmentation, we applied it, we saw that it should work, and we then went back to other theory, and in this time we went back to project management theory to see how we could make sense of it. And we went through some iterative loops with in-depth expert interviews with Tim to see how we could make sense of what we found. And then we came up with some theory suggestions, which is what I'll share with you at the end. So the first thing, we actually found a very nice paper that had categorised different types of project management. That's what you guys are used to. This strategic planning nonsense that I talk about and demand profiling is not your cup of tea. So let's try and bring those two worlds together. And so the first thing that we identified was that actually you need to recognise that corner of Sam Stacey's diagram, and that strategic planning, the ability to recognise different demand profiles of individual projects and groups of, is actually a portfolio management capability. In the water company, the person that was doing the planning, first and foremost, they need to have that strategic planning capability to be able to identify that underlying stable demand and make sure they then contract with their supply chain in the right way. The second thing then we did, sort of building upon that concept, was then to say, okay, we've essentially identified a new type of programme management. We would encourage people to identify the programme of repeatable projects. So normally a programme, the projects within it have the same strategic objective, but they could actually be doing different things. What we're saying here is a programme of repeatable projects would be, say, for instance, in this case, the upgrade of the same asset. But you're just going to do it because those assets are all over a region, so say here they'd be all over Yorkshire, rather than viewing it as the upgrade of each water station separately. You would see that as a programme of upgrading all 20 water stations, and over the 5 years you'd try to split it out so that they were equidistant, so that you were doing them with a periodicity of starting one project off each every 3 months. And so our second thing said that projects that contribute to the strategic upgrade of a particular aspect of infrastructure should be considered as a programme of interrelated repeatable projects that will benefit from delivery of economies of repetition. So we're moving away from this idea of economies of scale or economies of scope. We're saying actually you are going to get more productive if you can identify things that are the same and then you can do them more than once. That's manufacturing. That's what we do in manufacturing. It's not all about off-site. It's about that manufacturing mindset which starts with planning. And therefore, and this comes back to what happened in Terminal 5. So talking to Tim, we were all obsessed with Terminal 5, but talking to Tim, he'd say it's not all about Terminal 5, it was about BAA. And it was about this heritage that BAA had when they owned all of the airports. Because when BAA owned all of the airports, they essentially had economies of repetition. They would upgrade they'd resurface one airport runway, then they'd do the next and the next and the next. And by doing that, they would learn, and each time they learned, they would get better at it. And then when they needed to do something more complicated, they developed all these lower level capabilities which they could combine together to do something more complicated. And so there's this and in a way you can argue therefore that some of the ways that we've gone strategically actually make that far more difficult for us to do. But the argument here is that if you want to be innovative, the best way you can be innovative is actually to have developed a lot of lower level capabilities through economies of repetition, so that when you do need to be innovative, you can draw on those resources to bring them together creatively to be innovative. And what we would argue, if you do that, you're going to be both effective, because you're doing the right things, and you're going to be efficient. And this is nothing to do with making things off-site. This is nothing to do with building something that looks like a factory. This is all about essentially using the principles of manufacturing, which is all about those 5 lean principles. And it's all about that bottom right hand or left hand, depending on which way you're looking at it, box of Sam Stacey's model, which is about planning. So the 5 key lessons that came out from the work that we did. The first is really that this has broader applicability than just the water company example that we worked with. In fact, we would argue that it could apply to any portfolio of infrastructure projects, and that's not just for construction. It would equally apply to some of the work that, for instance, I'd done with the Ministry of Defence looking at warships and submarines. And equally, it's applicable to off-site and off-site construction, because off-site construction could also be viewed as a programme of repeatable projects. But most importantly, it really does start with the ability to recognise different types of project profiles at the portfolio management level. So just going back to our water company example, it started with that water company and their planning department ability to say, here's 5 years, over that 5 years, which are our projects that are repeatable and we can view as a programme of repeatable projects, and which are our projects that are perhaps more emergent, or we need to actually allow some buffer around to allow for changes in the budgeting process. And what companies need to recognise is that actually if they want to manage their portfolio more effectively, if they can do that, then it's actually going to allow much greater effectiveness in the delivery of that portfolio, so it's going to enable them to be more productive, because what it sets up is the supply chain to compete. Because there's an old adage which says a fish rots from the head, and so therefore, but equally a fish can be healthy from the head too. So if we plan well at the front, if we set up that programme of repeatable projects, it enables the major contractor to deal with that in a repeatable way, and then it enables them then, when they contract with their suppliers, to actually use their framework agreements as intended. So they can set up the framework agreement, they can give the contractor repeatable work, those contractors can give their suppliers repeatable work, and their suppliers repeatable work. And it does enable competition, because if your framework agreement's working well, you can then flex the volumes year on year between the suppliers based on their performance. But for this to work, the end customers, and this is going that step further, is the people like Highways England or the utility companies, the regulators. It's going to need them to engage with their supply chains in a different way. It's going to need them to actually recognise the importance of bringing those longer planning horizons to fruition. Because last but not least, Organisations may think they want to be innovative. It sounds great to say we're going to be an innovative company, but innovation comes at a cost. And fundamentally, we haven't got the bandwidth to be innovative in everything that we do, nor do we actually need to be. And some of the best innovations are actually a process innovation, which is actually about making things more efficient. And so by taking this approach to demand profiling, we can be both effective in that we're doing the right things, we're utilising stable demand where we have to, we can perhaps be more accommodating of more variable demand where we have to, and in that way we can actually deliver innovation in a more cost-effective way. But it's only being innovative where we really have to be.